20. Britain, the triumph of Parliament. The Restoration, 1660 to 1688, the later Stuarts. What was restored in 1660 was not only the monarchy in the person of Charles II, but also the Church of England and the Parliament. Everything, legally, was supposed to be as it had been in 1640. The difference was that Charles II, knowing the fate of his father, was careful not to provoke Parliament to extremes, and that the classes represented in 342 Parliament, frightened by the disturbances of the past 20 years, were now more warmly loyal to the king and more willing to uphold the established Church of England. 173. Parliament during the Restoration enacted some far-reaching legislation. It changed the legal basis of land tenure, abolishing certain old feudal payments owed by landholders to the king. The possession of land thus came to resemble modern private property, and the landowning class became more definitely a propertied aristocracy. In place of the feudal dues to the king, which had been automatically payable, Parliament arranged for the king to receive income in the form of taxation, which Parliament could raise or reduce in amount. This gave a new power to Parliament and a new flexibility to government. The aristocracy thus cleared their property of customary restrictions and obligations, and at the same time undertook to support the state by imposing taxes on themselves. The English aristocracy proved more willing than the corresponding classes on the continent to pay a large share of the expenses of government. Its reward for this taxation was that, for a century and a half, it virtually ran the government to the exclusion of everyone else. Landowners in this period directed not only national affairs through Parliament, but also local affairs as justices of the peace. The justices, drawn from the gentry of each county, decided small lawsuits, punished misdemeanors, and supervised the parish officials charged with poor relief and care of the roads. The regime of the landlord justices came to be called the squirearchy. New legislation utterly differs. Other classes drew less immediate advantage from the Restoration. The Navigation Act of 1651 was extended so that commercial, shipping, and manufacturing interests were well protected. But in other ways, the landed classes now in power showed themselves unsympathetic to the business classes of the towns. Many people in the towns were dissenters, including the Puritans who refused to accept the restored Church of 343 England. Parliament excluded dissenters from the town corporations, or governing bodies, and forbade any dissenting clergymen to teach school or come within 5 miles of an incorporated town. New laws prohibited all kinds of religious meetings, which were called conventicles, not held according to the forms and by the authority of the Church of England. The effect was that many middle-class townspeople found it difficult or impossible to follow their preferred religion, to obtain an education for their children, either elementary or advanced, for Oxford and Cambridge were a part of the established church, to take part in local affairs through the town corporations, or to sit in the House of Commons. The lowest classes, the very poor, were discouraged by the same laws from following sectarian and visionary preachers. Exclusion of dissenters. Another enactment fell upon poor people alone and reduced their economic opportunities by impeding their movement around the country. The Act of Settlement of 1662, which decentralized the administration of the poor law, made each parish responsible only for its own paupers. Poor people, who were very numerous, were condemned to remain in the parishes where they lived. A large group of English people was thus immobilized within their hometowns. But it was not long after the Restoration that Parliament and King were again at odds. The main issue was again religion. Many Protestants throughout Europe at this time were returning voluntarily to Roman Catholicism, a tendency naturally dreaded by the Protestant churches. This kind of conversion was most conspicuously illustrated when the daughter of Gustavus Adolphus himself, Queen Christina of Sweden, abdicated her throne and was received into the Roman Church. In England, the national feeling was excitedly anti-Catholic. No measures were more popular than those against popery, and the squires in Parliament, stiffly loyal to the Church of England, dreaded papists even more than dissenters. The king, 174-344 Charles II, was personally inclined to Catholicism. He admired the magnificent monarchy of Louis XIV, which he would have liked to duplicate, insofar as possible, in England. At odds with his parliament, Charles VI made overtures to Louis XIV. The secret Treaty of Dover of 1670 was the outcome. Charles thereby agreed to join Louis IV in his expected war against the Dutch, and Louis agreed to pay the King of England 3 million livres a year during the war. He hoped also that Charles II would soon find it opportune to rejoin the Roman Church. Catholic conversions. While these arrangements were unknown in detail in England, it was known that Charles II was well disposed to the French and to Roman Catholicism. England went to war again with the Dutch. The king's brother and heir, James, Duke of York, publicly announced his conversion to Rome. Charles II, in a declaration of indulgence, announced the non-enforcement of laws against dissenters. The king declared that he favored general toleration, but it was rightly feared that his real aim was to promote Roman Catholicism in England. Parliament retorted in 1673 by passing the Test Act, which required all office holders to take communion in the Church of England. The Test Act renewed the legislation against dissenters and also made it impossible for Catholics to serve in the government or in the Army and Navy. The Test Act remained on the English statute books until 1828. Charles II and the Test Act. Although Charles's pro-French and pro-Catholic policies were extremely unpopular, the situation might not have come to a head except for the avowed Catholicism and French orientation of Charles's brother James, due to be the next king because Charles had no legitimate children. This impending transition shaped the emergence of opposing political factions, who came to be known as Whigs and Tories. A 345-strong movement developed in Parliament to exclude James by law from the throne. The exclusionists, and those generally who were most suspicious of the king, Catholics and the French, received the nickname of Whigs. The king's supporters were popularly called Tories. The Whigs, while backed by the middle class and merchants of London, drew their main strength from the upper aristocracy, especially certain great noblemen who might expect, if the king's power were weakened, to play a prominent part in ruling the country themselves. The Tories were the party of the lesser aristocracy and gentry who were suspicious of the moneyed interest of London and who felt a strong loyalty to church and king. These two parties, or at least their names, became permanently established in English public life. But all the Whigs and Tories together at this time did not number more than a few thousand persons. The Revolution of 1688, James II, despite Whig vexation, became king in 1685. He soon antagonized even the Tories, who strongly supported the Church of England. As landowners, they appointed most of the parish clergy, who imparted Tory sentiments to the rural population, and members of landowning Tory families frequently became bishops, archdeacons, university functionaries, and other high personnel of the church. The laws keeping dissenters and Catholics from office had given Anglicans, i.e., members of the Church of England, a monopoly in local and national government and in the army and navy. James II acted as if there were no Test Act, claiming the right to suspend its operation in individual cases, and appointed a good many Catholics to influential and lucrative positions. He offered a program, as his brother had done, of general religious toleration, to allow Protestant dissenters, as well as Roman Catholics, to participate in public life. 175. Such a program was repugnant to the Church of England. 7 bishops refused to endorse it. They were prosecuted for disobedience to the king, but were acquitted by the jury. James, by these actions, violated the liberties of the established church, threatened the Anglican monopoly 346 of church and state, and aroused the popular terrors of popery. He was also forced to take the position philosophically set forth by his grandfather James I, that a king of England could make and unmake the law by his own will. The Tories joined the Whigs in opposition. In 1688, a son was born to James II and baptized into the Catholic faith. The prospect now opened up of an indefinite line of Catholic rulers in England. The leaders of both parties thereupon abandoned James II and offered the throne to his grown daughter Mary, who was brought up a Protestant before her father's conversion to Rome. Whigs and Tories in opposition to the crown. Mary was the wife of William of Orange. William, it will be recalled, had spent his adult life blocking the ambitions of the King of France, who had threatened Europe with a universal monarchy by absorbing or inheriting the global territories of Spain. To William III, it would be a mere distraction to be husband to a Queen of England, or even to be king in his own name, unless England could be brought to serve his own purposes. He was immutably Dutch. His purpose was to save Holland and hence to ruin Louis XIV. His chief interest in England was to bring the English into his balance of power against France. Because the English were generally anti-French and had chafed under the pro-French tendencies of their kings, William quickly reached an understanding with the discontented Whigs and Tories. Protected by a written invitation from prominent Englishmen, he invaded England with a considerable army. James II fled, and William was proclaimed co-ruler with Mary over England and Scotland. In the next year, 1690, at the Boyne River in Ireland, a motley army of Dutchmen, Germans, Scots, and French Huguenots under William III defeated a French and Irish force led by James II. Thus, the constitutional power of the English Parliament was reaffirmed, and Anglican Protestantism remained the official religion of the English nation. James II fled to France. William invades England. 347. Louis XIV, of course, refused to recognize his inveterate enemy as ruler of England. He maintained James at the French court with all the honors due the English king. It was thereafter one of his principal war aims to restore the Catholic and Stuart dynasty across the Channel. The English now had new reasons to fight the French. A French victory would mean counter-revolution and royal absolutism in England. The whole revolution of 1688 was at stake in the French wars. In 1689, Parliament enacted a Bill of Rights, stipulating that no law could be suspended by the king, as the Test Act had been. No taxes could be raised or army maintained except by parliamentary consent, and no subject, however poor, could be arrested and detained without legal process. William III accepted these articles as conditions to receiving the crown. Thereafter, the relation between king and people was a kind of contract. It was further provided by the Act of Settlement of 1701 that no Catholic could be King of England. This excluded the descendants of James II, known in the following century as the Pretenders. Parliament also passed the Toleration Act of 1689, which allowed Protestant dissenters to practice their religion, but still excluded them from political life and public service. Because ways of evading these restrictions were soon found, and because even Catholics were not molested unless they supported the Pretenders, there was thereafter no serious trouble over religion in England and lowland Scotland. Bill of Rights and the Toleration Act, 176. Historical interpretations and debates. The meaning of the English Revolution, 348. Debates about the significance of the mid-17th century English Revolution often focus on how the revolution transformed the political or economic influence of various social groups. Although many historians have argued that landed aristocratic elites emerged from the 17th century upheavals as the dominant power in English society, there is much disagreement about whether the revolutionary events also enhanced or weakened the political position of other people in the multiple layers of English social life. Such differences appear in the writings of Hugh R. Trevor Roper and Phyllis Mack, who seek to explain the revolution's historical meaning for some of its diverse social groups and participants. Hugh R. Trevor Roper, The Social Causes of the Great Rebellion, 1957. The Great Rebellion was not the clear-headed self-assertion of the rising bourgeoisie and gentry, but rather the blind protest of the depressed gentry. It was the blind revolt of the gentry against the court, of the provinces against the capital, the backwash against a century of administrative and economic centralization. Since they were animated by passion, not by positive political ideas, the radical gentry, when they were in power, found themselves without a policy. Ultimately, after a period of fumbling experiments, they gave up the effort, accepted back the old political system, and sank into political quietism. The rebellion itself took place because a failure of political ability coincided with a general economic crisis. Perhaps indirectly, the rebellion may have forwarded the undoubted change of mentality between the early and the late 17th century in England. But equally, it may have impeded that progress for a generation. What we can say is that it was not, in itself, a successful stage in the rise of the bourgeoisie. Phyllis Mack, Visionary Women, Ecstatic Prophecy in 17th Century England, 1992. The religious prophets of the Civil War period, many of them laborers, farmers, or artisans, understood their condemnation of an engorged clergy and aristocracy as both a spiritual and social protest. And since women were commonly identified with the poor and deprived, one would expect that those radical movements that championed the poor and deprived would also champion the increased authority of women. Yet, those sects that were 349 most radical in challenging traditional social and economic relationships were least likely to be attentive to the needs and rights of oppressed people who were female. Conversely, those women who were most conscious of their authority as females, Quaker and non-Quaker, were also those middle and upper class women who had the least affinity with the plight of the laboring classes. Women as religious prophets enjoyed virtually the only taste of public authority they would ever know. Some of them used that authority to write and publish their own works, to organize separate women's meetings, or to challenge the greater authority of the male leaders. The historian's attentiveness to the issue of gender is likely to raise more questions than it answers. But it suggests that the private actions of ordinary individuals have affected larger social and political movements as profoundly as the deeds of great and famous men, forcing us to broaden our definition of the term politics. Sources: H.R. Trevor Roper, The Social Causes of the Great Rebellion, in Men and Events, Historical Essays, New York, Harper & Brothers, 1957, pp. 200, 204-205. Phyllis Mack, Visionary Women, Ecstatic Prophecy in 17th Century England, Berkeley, CA, University of California Press, 1992, pp. 4-5. 177, 305th England in the 17th century. The maps show the principal 17th century English towns and the rough division of the country into royalist and parliamentary regions during the English Civil War. King Charles I drew his strongest support from the north and west. Parliament drew its strongest support from the southeast and from London. Similar regional political patterns emerged in later conflicts between the royalist Tories and the parliamentary Whigs. The Whigs were generally supported by the upper aristocracy and the commercial classes of London, who opposed the pro-French, pro-Catholic policies of the Stuart kings Charles II and James II. The English Parliament could make no laws for Scotland, however, and it was feared that James II might someday be restored in his northern kingdom. The securing of the parliamentary revolution in England and of the island's defenses against France required that the two kingdoms be organically joined, but there was little sentiment in Scotland for a merger with the English. The English tempted Scottish political leaders with economic advantages. The Scots still had no rights in the English East India Company, nor in the English colonies, nor within the English system of mercantilism and navigation acts. They obtained such rights by consenting to a union. Although anti-merger sentiment remained strong in much of Scotland, the United Kingdom of Great Britain was created 1708 in 1707. The Scots retained their own legal system and established Presbyterian Church, but their government and parliament were merged with those of England. The term British came into use to refer to both English and Scots. Chronology of notable events, 1642. 1713-1642 to 1648, Civil War in England. 1649, execution of King Charles I in London. 1649 to 1658, Oliver Cromwell leads the English Commonwealth. 35-1-1660, 1661, 1685, 1688, 72 to 1713, and Protectorate. Restoration of English monarchy. King Charles II. King Louis XIV takes personal control of French government. Reign continues to 1715. Revocation of Edict of Nantes. Persecution of French Protestants. Glorious Revolution. Brings William and Mary to English throne and strengthens power of Parliament. War of Spanish Succession. Balance of power limits French expansion. 1713. Peace of Utrecht. As for Ireland, it was now feared as a Stuart and French intrigue. The Revolution of 1688 marked the climax of a long record of trouble. Ireland had never been simply conquered by England, though certain English, or rather Anglo-Norman families had carved out estates there since the 12th century. By the end of the Middle Ages, Ireland was organized as a separate kingdom with its own parliament, subordinate to the English crown. During the Reformation, the Irish remained Catholic while England turned Protestant, but the monasteries were dissolved in Ireland as in England, and the organized church as such, the established Church of Ireland, with its apparatus of bishoprics, parishes, and tithes, became an Anglican communion in which the mass of native Irish had no interest. Next came the plantation of Ulster, already mentioned, in which a mass of newcomers, mainly Scottish and Presbyterian, settled in the northern part of the island. Then, in Cromwell's time, English landlords spread through the rest of the country, or rather, a new Anglo-Irish upper class developed, in which English landowning families, residing most often in England, added the income from Irish estates to their miscellaneous revenues. The Irish threat to the Revolution of 1688, 352 Ireland, therefore by the close of the 17th century, was a very mixed country. Probably 2/3 of its population was Catholic, of generally Celtic ethnic background. Perhaps a fifth was Presbyterian, with recent Scottish connections. The small remainder was made up of Anglicans, largely Anglo-Irish of recent or distant origin in England, who controlled most of the land, manned the official church, and were influential in the Irish Parliament. It was essentially a landlord and peasant society, in which the Presbyterian and Catholic populations were overwhelmingly agricultural and poor. Towns were small, and the middle class scarcely developed. After the Revolution of 1688, in which the final overthrow of James II took place in Ireland at the Boyne River, the English feared Ireland as a source of danger to the post-revolutionary arrangements in England, and as a likely site for anti-English resistance to develop among subjugated Catholics. English elites who were defending their own liberties 179 at home thus set about destroying the religious, political, and social liberties of Irish Catholics. In addition to the burden of an alien church and absentee landlordism, the Irish were now subjected to a new penal code. Catholic clergy were banished, and Catholics were forbidden to vote or to sit in the Irish Parliament. Catholic teachers were forbidden to teach, and Catholic parents were forbidden to send children overseas to be educated in Catholic schools. No Catholic could take a degree at Trinity College, Dublin University, an Anglican institution. Catholics in Ireland were forbidden to purchase land, to lease it for more than 31 years, to inherit it from a Protestant, or even to own a horse worth more than £5. Catholics were forbidden to be attorneys, to serve as constables, or, in most trades, to have more than 2 apprentices. Some disabilities fell on the Protestant Irish also. Thus, Irish shipping was excluded from the British colonies, nor could the Irish import colonial goods except through England. Export of Irish woolens and glass manufactures was prohibited. No import tariff on English manufactures could be levied by the Irish Parliament. About all that was left to the Irish in international 353 trade was the export of agricultural produce, and the foreign exchange acquired in this way went very largely to pay the rents to absentee landlords. Restrictions for Irish Catholics. The purpose of the penal code was in part strategic, to weaken Ireland as a potentially hostile country during a long period of English wars with France. In part, it was commercial, to favor English manufacturers by removing Irish competition. And in part, it was social, to confirm the position of the Anglican interest, or ascendancy as it came to be called. Parts of the code were removed piecemeal in the following decades, and a Catholic merchant class grew up in the 18th century. But much remained in effect for a long time, so that, for example, a Catholic could not vote for members of the Irish Parliament until 1793, and even then could not be elected to it. In general, the Irish emerged from the 17th century as the most repressed people of Western Europe. England, immediately after the expulsion of James II, joined William III's coalition against France. To the alliance, England brought a highly competent naval force, together with very considerable wealth. William's government, to finance the war, borrowed £1,200,000 from a syndicate of private lenders, who in return for holding government bonds were given the privilege of operating a bank. Thus originated in 1694 both the Bank of England and the British national debt. Owners of liquid assets, merchants of London, and Whig aristocrats, having lent their money to the new regime, had a compelling reason to defend it against the French and James II. And having at last a government whose policies they could control, they were willing to entrust it with money in large amounts. The national debt rapidly rose, while the credit of the government held consistently good. And for many years, people on the continent were astonished at the wealth that the British government could tap at will and the quantities of money that it could pour into the wars of Europe. Coalition against France, 354. The events of 1688 came to be known to the English as the Glorious Revolution. The revolution was portrayed as vindicating the principles of parliamentary government, the rule of law, and even the right of rebellion against tyranny. Though, as noted above, England's governing classes denied all such rights in Ireland and in their overseas colonies. The overthrow of James II and the enactment of new parliamentary restrictions on the power of English kings have often been depicted as key moments in the growth of English constitutional self-government. Political writers like John Locke, shortly after the events, helped to give wide currency to these ideas. There was some justification for these views, even though in more recent times, some writers have deglorified the revolution of 1688. They point out that it was an upper-class movement, promoted and maintained by an exclusionary landed aristocracy. The parliament that boldly asserted itself against the king was at the same time closing itself to large segments of the English people. Where in the Middle Ages members of the House of Commons had usually received pay for their services, this custom disappeared in the 17th century, so that thereafter only men with independent incomes could sit. After the parliamentary triumph of 1688, this tendency became a matter of law. An Act of 1710 required members of the House of Commons to possess private incomes at such a level that only a few thousand persons could legally qualify. This income had to come from the ownership of land. England from 1688 to 1832 was the best example in modern times of a true aristocracy, that is, of a country in which the men of an aristocratic landowning class not only enjoyed privileges, but also conducted the government. But the landowning interest was then the only social group that was sufficiently wealthy, numerous, educated, and self-conscious to stand politically on its own feet. Although it depended on the labor and trade of men and women who could never vote or hold office, the rule of the gentlemen of England was, within its strict social limits, an evolving early regime of political liberty